Imagine standing in a kitchen for 6 hours, no phone, no shortcuts, no breaks, just you, heat, aroma, and patience. Now, ask yourself this, would you do it? Most people wouldn't. And that's exactly why what you're about to hear is so powerful, because this is not just a recipe, it's a story of discipline, culture, and something so deeply human that it transforms a simple dish into what many are calling the best in the world. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll not only understand why it might completely change the way you think about food, effort, and even success. This recipe, shared by an African man, is not about fancy ingredients or expensive tools. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about taking basic, accessible components and elevating them through time, technique, and intention.
That's when.
Now let's talk about those 6 hours. Why 6 hours without a break? From a physiological and sensory perspective, cooking like this activates layers of Slow heat breaks down fibers, releases natural sugars, enhances umami, and allows spices to penetrate deeply. But beyond the science, there's something else happening. Focus. When you commit to a process without interruption, your brain enters a state of deep engagement. This isn't just cooking anymore, it's almost meditative. And then there's culture. Recipes like this aren't created overnight. They're passed down, refined, and protected. Every step has a reason. Every minute has meaning. This dish carries generations of knowledge, survival, celebration, and identity. When you taste it, you're not just tasting food or experiencing history, but here's where it gets even more interesting. Why do people call it the best in the world? Scientifically, our brains respond strongly to layered flavors: sweet, salty, spicy, and umami working together. Psychologically, effort changes perception. When something takes 6 hours of continuous work, your brain assigns it higher value. You don't just eat it to appreciate it. And that brings us to a deeper lesson. This recipe is not just about food, it's about life. In a world obsessed with shortcuts, instant results, and convenience, this is a reminder that some of the best outcomes require time, consistency, and patience. You can't rush excellence, whether it's cooking, fitness, success, or relationships. The principle is the same. So the next time you think about taking the easy route, remember this. The difference between average and extraordinary often comes down to one thing: how long you're willing to stay committed without quitting. And maybe, just maybe, the real reason this recipe is called the best in the world isn't just because of how it tastes, but because of what it represents. When we talk about the power of simplicity in food, what we're really uncovering is something deeper than just cooking. It's about understanding how less can actually become more when it's done with intention. Most people assume that the best recipes in the world require rare ingredients, complicated techniques, or expensive tools, but that belief is often what disconnects us from truly great food. The reality is that some of the most powerful, unforgettable flavors come from the simplest combinations of ingredients that are accessible, familiar, and often overlooked. What transforms them is not complexity, but attention, time, and precision. When you take a basic ingredient and treat it with respect, when you allow it to cook slowly, when you balance it carefully with spices, when you give it the time it needs to evolve, you begin to unlock layers of flavor that most people never experience because they're always rushing. Simplicity forces you to focus on the fundamentals. It removes distractions and highlights what really matters: technique, timing, and understanding how ingredients interact with each other. And there's also a psychological shift that happens when you embrace. You become more present. Instead of chasing the next ingredient or the next shortcut, you start paying attention to what's already in front of you. You notice the aroma changing over time, the texture developing, the color deepening. This awareness is what separates average cooking from exceptional cooking. It's not about doing more, it's about doing what matters better. And this is exactly why a simple recipe, when executed with discipline, can outperform even the most elaborate dishes. Complexity can sometimes hide mistakes, but simplicity exposes everything. If your technique is off, you'll take it. If your timing is wrong, you'll see it. There's no place to hide, which means you're forced to improve. And over time, that improvement compounds. You develop a deeper understanding of heat, seasoning, and balance. You start to trust the process instead of rushing it. And that trust is what allows simple food to reach an entirely different level. But beyond cooking, this idea applies to life as well. We often believe that success requires doing more effort, more strategies, more distractions, but just like in food, the real power comes from mastering the basics and repeating them consistently. Simplicity is not weakness, it's refinement. It's the ability to strip away everything unnecessary and focus only on what truly creates. And when you apply that mindset, whether in the kitchen or in your daily life, you start to realize that excellence isn't built on complexity. It's built on doing simple things with extraordinary consistency. When we talk about why this recipe requires 6 hours without a break, it's easy to assume that it's just about cooking time, but that would be missing the deeper point. This process is not simply about letting something sit on heat. It's about continuous involvement, constant adjustment, and an unbroken connection between the person and the food. Every minute matters and every stage builds on the last. When heat is applied slowly over time, something remarkable begins to happen at a molecular level. Proteins start to break down, connective tissues soften, and flavors begin to concentrate rather than evaporate. Spices don't just sit on the surface, they penetrate deeply, merging into the structure of the dish itself. And then if you walk away, if you lose focus, even for a short period, you risk interrupting that delicate balance. The temperature might fluctuate, ingredients might overcook or underdevelop, and the harmony of flavors can be lost. That's why this recipe demands presence. It's not passive cooking, it's active, intentional, and continuous. There's also a rhythm to this kind of cooking that most people are unfamiliar with. It's not about setting a timer and waiting, it's about observing, adjusting, and responding. You stir at the right moment, not because a clock told you to, but because the texture and aroma signal that it's time. You adjust the heat based on how the ingredients are reacting, not based on a fixed instruction. This creates a feedback loop between you and the dish where you are constantly making small decisions that shape the final outcome. Over 6 hours, these small decisions compound into something extraordinary. Each adjustment might seem minor on its own, but together they create depth, balance, and richness that cannot be replicated with shortcuts. From a mental perspective, staying engaged for 6 hours without a break pushes you into a state of deep focus. Your mind stops jumping between distractions and begins to settle into the task at hand. This level of concentration is rare in today's world, where we are constantly pulled in different directions. When you sustain it, something shifts. You become more aware, more precise, and more connected to what you're doing. Cooking stops being a task and becomes an experience, and that experience influences the outcome in ways that go beyond technique. There's a sense of care, intention, and consistency that gets infused into the process. And then there's the discipline aspect. Committing to 6 hours without stepping away is not easy. It requires patience, endurance, and a willingness to delay gratification. You don't get immediate results. There's no instant reward. Instead, you invest time and effort with the understanding that the payoff will come later. This mirrors how many of the most meaningful achievements in life are built. They require sustained effort over time, often without visible progress in the early stages. But if you stay consistent, if you don't break the process, the results eventually compound into something far greater than what shortcuts could ever produce. So this 6-hour requirement is not just about cooking. It's a test of focus, a lesson in patience, and a demonstration of what happens when you fully commit to a process without interruption. When we explore the cultural roots behind a recipe like this, we begin to understand that it's not just about ingredients or technique, it's about identity, history, and survival woven into every step. Food, especially in many African traditions, has never been just about nourishment. It carries stories of communities, of resilience through hardship, of celebration in times of joy, and of knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. This particular recipe didn't appear overnight. It evolved slowly, shaped by the environment, the available resources, and the lived experiences of the people who created it. Every ingredient has a purpose, often tied to what was locally grown, traded, or preserved. Every method reflects adaptation, how to make the most out of what you have, how to enhance flavor without waste, how to create something deeply satisfying even in limited conditions. In many African cultures, cooking is not an isolated activity, it's communal. It brings people together, whether it's families preparing meals side by side or entire communities gathering around food during celebrations. Recipes like this often require time and collective effort, which naturally encourages connection. While one person stirs, another prepares ingredients, someone else manages the fire or heat. Through this process, knowledge is shared not through written instructions, but through observation, repetition, and storytelling. A child learns not just how to cook, but when to add a spice by watching their elders, by listening to the subtle cues in aroma and texture. This is how tradition is preserved not in books, but in practice. There's also a deep respect for process embedded in these cultural roots. The idea of cooking for 6 hours without a break might seem extreme in a fast-paced world, but in many traditional contexts, time is not seen as something to minimize, it's something to invest. Slow cooking methods were often necessary, whether due to tougher cuts of meat, the need to extract maximum flavor, or the limitations of cooking tools. But over time, what began as necessity became people learned how to use time as an ingredient, how to layer flavors gradually, how to transform simple components into something rich and complex. This respect for time reflects a broader worldview, one that values patience, endurance, and craftsmanship. Another important aspect is symbolism. Certain dishes are tied to specific events, weddings, harvests, religious gatherings, or rites of passage. Preparing these meals is not just about feeding people, it's about honoring tradition and marking important moments. The act of cooking becomes a form of expression, a way to show care, respect, and pride in one's heritage. A dish that takes hours of continuous effort, it's often seen as a gesture of dedication, a way of giving something meaningful to others. And what makes this even more powerful is how these cultural elements influence the final experience of the food. When you taste a dish like this, you're not just experiencing flavor, you're experiencing context. You're tasting the result of generations refining a process, of people adapting and perfecting techniques over time. And that's why it stands out, because it's not just cooked, it's lived, shared, and preserved through culture, turning a simple recipe into something that feels deeply authentic and unforgettable. When we talk about why this recipe feels like the best in the world, we're stepping into the science of taste, something far more complex than just flavor on your tongue. What you perceive as incredible isn't just about one ingredient or one step, it's the result of multiple sensory systems working together in perfect alignment. Your taste buds can only detect a few basic categories: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, but what creates that unforgettable experience is how these elements are layered, balanced, and timed throughout the cooking process. In a slow 6-hour recipe, these layers don't collide, they build. Each phase of cooking unlocks new compounds, deepens existing ones, and smooths out harsh edges that would otherwise overpower the dish. One of the most important scientific processes happening here is the Maillard reaction, where proteins and sugars interact under heat to create complex, savory flavor. As the dish continues to cook, fats begin to render and carry flavor molecules more efficiently across your palate, making every bite feel richer and more satisfying. Spices, when given enough time, release their essential oils gradually, blending into the dish instead of sitting on top of it. This creates what scientists call flavor integration, where you can't isolate one ingredient because everything has merged into a unified profile. But taste is not just about your tongue strong it's heavily influenced by your sense of smell. In fact, a large portion of what you perceive as flavor comes from aroma. During long cooking processes, volatile compounds are continuously released, evolve, and recombine, creating a dynamic aromatic profile. This is why a dish like this doesn't just taste good, it smells irresistible long before you even take a bite. And that smell primes your brain, preparing it to expect something rewarding. By the time you finally eat, your brain is already engaged, already anticipating pleasure, which amplifies the overall experience. There's also a neurological component that most people overlook. Your brain doesn't evaluate food in isolation, it considers effort, anticipation, and context. When you know that something took 6 hours of uninterrupted work, your brain assigns it higher value. This is known as effort justification, where the perceived reward increases based on the effort and flavor you're experiencing, the culmination of time, discipline, and expectation, the culmination of time, discipline, and expectation. This psychological layer enhances the sensory one, making the food feel even more exceptional. Texture plays a role as well. Slow cooking transforms tough structures into tender, almost effortless bites. The contrast between softness and slight resistance, between richness and subtle crispness, if any stage includes it, creates a multidimensional experience in your mouth. Your brain responds strongly to this variation because it keeps the experience engaging rather than predictable. What makes this recipe stand out scientifically is that it aligns all these elements: chemical reactions, aroma development, texture transformation, and psychological anticipation into one continuous process. Every stage builds on the previous one, creating a final result that feels complete, balanced, and deeply satisfying. And that's why it earns a title like the best in the world, not because of but because it systematically activates every mechanism your body uses to recognize something as truly exceptional. When we look at patience, discipline, and the psychology of cooking, this recipe becomes something far more meaningful than just a method. It becomes a reflection of how the human mind responds to effort, focus, and delayed gratification. But mentally, it challenges everything about how we're wired. Is not physically complicated, but mentally, it challenges everything about how we're wired today. We are used to speed, to instant results, to constant stimulation, switching tasks or looking for shortcut. Whether it's checking our phones, switching tasks, or looking for shortcuts. But a process like this forces you into the opposite pattern and to commit to something that doesn't give you immediate feedback or instant satisfaction. At the beginning, it feels manageable. You're engaged, curious, maybe even as time passes, your mind starts to resist. It looks for distractions. It questions whether the effort is worth it. It tries to convince you to step away just for a moment. This is where discipline comes in, not as motivation, but as a decision to continue despite that resistance. And the longer you stay committed, the more your brain begins to adapt. The urge to quit doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes quieter. Your focus deepens. You stop thinking about the time and start paying attention to the process itself, the sound of the cooking, the changes in aroma, the subtle shifts in texture. Is psychological, but it has real effects. When you remain engaged in a single task for an extended period, your brain can enter a state of sustained attention, sometimes described as a flow-like state. In this state, your awareness becomes sharper, your actions more precise, and your sense of time begins to change. You're no longer counting minutes or responding to dish needs at each time. Cooking becomes less about following instructions and more about understanding what the dish needs at each stage, and that understanding improves the outcome. Small details that you would normally miss become obvious, and those details are often what separate a good result from an exceptional one. There's also a deeper psychological reward tied to completing something that required this level of patience. When you finally reach the end of those 6 hours, your brain releases a sense of satisfaction that is very different from quick wins. It's not just relief, it's fulfillment. You know you stayed consistent, that you didn't take shortcuts, that you saw the process through from beginning to end. That feeling reinforces the value of discipline, making it more likely that you'll apply the same mindset in other areas of your life. And that's where this goes beyond cooking. The same principles apply to anything meaningful meaningful, building strength, developing a skill, creating something valuable, or achieving long-term goals. Progress in these areas rarely comes from bursts of motivation. It comes from sustained effort over time. The ability to stay consistent when things feel slow or repetitive is what creates results that stand out. This recipe becomes a practical demonstration of that. It shows you in a very tangible way what happens when you resist the urge to rush and instead commit fully to the process. So patience here is not passive, it's active. Discipline is not restriction, it's focus. And the psychology behind it reveals something powerful. When you train yourself to stay engaged in a process without constantly seeking an escape, you don't just improve what you're doing, you fundamentally change how you approach effort, making it possible to achieve results that most people never reach because they simply aren't willing to stay long enough. When we look at what this recipe teaches us about life and consistency, it becomes clear that the real lesson has very little to do with food and everything to do with how results are actually created. Most people are focused on outcomes. They want the final dish, the success, the transformation, but they underestimate the process required to get there. This recipe forces you to confront that reality. It shows you in a very practical and undeniable way that extraordinary results are not built on bursts of effort, but on sustained, consistent action over. You don't get to skip steps, you don't get to rush through it, and you don't get rewarded immediately. Instead, you invest effort continuously, often without seeing dramatic changes in the moment, trusting that those small, repeated actions are adding up to something bigger. Consistency in this context is not about perfection, it's about showing up again and again, even when the process feels repetitive or slow. During those 6 hours, there are no big milestones, no instant breakthroughs. It's the same motion, the same attention, the same commitment, repeated over and over. And that's exactly where most people struggle because repetition feels boring and the human mind naturally seeks novelty. But what this recipe demonstrates is that repetition is not the enemy of progress, it's the foundation of it. Every time you stir, adjust, or observe, you are reinforcing the process. Each small action might seem insignificant on its own, but together they create a level of depth and quality that cannot be achieved any other way. There's also an important lesson in delayed gratification. In a world where we expect quick results, this process demands that you put in the effort long before you experience the reward. And that waiting is not wasted time, it's where the transformation happens. The flavors develop, the textures evolve, and the dish gradually becomes something far greater than what it started as. The same principle applies to personal growth, skill development, and success in any field. The most meaningful outcomes often take time to mature, and if you try to rush them, you compromise the result. Another key insight is the idea of trusting the process even when you can't fully see the progress. And ultimately, during most of those 6 hours, the changes are subtle. You don't always get immediate confirmation that what you're doing is working. But if you abandon the process too early or start cutting corners, you disrupt the entire outcome. This teaches you to stay committed even in uncertainty, to continue putting in effort even when the results are not yet visible. And over time, that builds a kind of mental resilience that carries over into other areas of life. What makes this lesson so powerful is that it's tangible. You can see, smell, and taste the result of consistency. You experience firsthand how small, disciplined actions compound into something remarkable. And once you understand that, it becomes harder to settle for shortcuts in other areas of your life because you've seen what happens when you stay consistent, when you respect the process, and when you give something the time it truly requires. You begin to realize that excellence is not something you achieve once, it's something you build step by step through consistent effort that most people are not willing to maintain long enough to see the full result. So when you step back and look at this entire journey, it becomes clear that this is not just a recipe, it's a blueprint for how simplicity, patience, culture, science, discipline, and consistency all come together to create something truly exceptional. What started as a story about a man cooking for 6 hours without a break transforms into a much bigger realization. The things we often overlook, time, time, focus, repetition are the very things that produce the highest level of result. It comes from respecting the process, staying present, and committing fully even when it's inconvenient. It shows us that when you slow down and give something your full attention, you unlock a level of quality that cannot be rushed or replicated. And more importantly, it reminds us that